Hello and welcome to this special edition of Broadcast on WION. My name is Mohammed Saleh. Now, Israel is facing a major diplomatic backlash over the airstrike that has resulted in the killing of 7 international aid workers who are delivering the desperately needed food and other humanitarian aid to the starving population in the Gaza Strip. Now, the Israeli Defense Forces Chief of Staff, Herzi Halevi, has issued an apology for the deadly Israeli airstrike on an aid convoy in Gaza that was deliberately targeted and struck by the Israelis. Now, he said that the strike was actually a result of misidentification. The Israeli Chief of Staff has further said that an independent body will carry out an investigation that will be completed in the coming days, and the findings of the investigation will be shared with the World Central Kitchen and other relevant international organizations. On the other hand, Israel's closest ally, the United States, has slammed the country over these strikes. And according to the White House, the American president reportedly is outraged and heartbroken by the Israeli airstrike on the humanitarian aid convoy. Joe Biden has again called on the state of Israel to do more to protect aid workers. Now, to help decode as to what is happening at this moment in the Gaza Strip, with respect to the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip and as to how we've ended up in this place. Anyway, we are being joined by Professor Glenn Diesen, who is a professor of international relations at the University of Southeastern Norway. Professor Diesen, thank you very much indeed, sir, for joining us here on WION.
My pleasure.
Now, the question that I want to start off with is this horrific incident where quite clearly a humanitarian aid convoy was struck deliberately by the Israelis using their air force, clearly points out that the reason why humanitarian aid is so hard for the Palestinians to access is because of this deliberate policy by the Israelis to target, it appears, the humanitarian aid convoys. What do you make of this?
Well, I think that if this was an isolated incident in which there were, 3 strikes against this convoy, this accident narrative might stand up. But I think it has to be seen in the wider context of Israeli attacks on aid workers, on food supplies, also the blockade on humanitarian aid, which is now resulting in mass starvation. And again, this is all happening while Gaza is under brutal siege. So you see this, this mass killing of journalists, children on a huge scale. And furthermore, in terms of the aid, we see that Israel continues to defy the UN's International Court of Justice, which demanded that Israel must do more to protect Gaza from the risk of genocide. What we see instead is that Israel appears to be tightening the access to humanitarian aid. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency, for example, has argued it's becoming more difficult now since the genocide case rather than less. Mm-hmm. But this is the key problem. Israel tends to argue that, effectively, a lot of these are in cahoots with Hamas, which makes it, which muddies the water in terms of who they're allowed to attack.
Herzi Halevi, the Chief of Staff of the Israeli army, he says that this is an attack that happened because of a misidentification. But it was 3 separate attacks that took place on this convoy. Do you buy that argument that he's making, that it was misidentification to strike specifically 3 targets in this convoy?
No, well, again, the first one could believe was an accident, but the second and third, then it gets very suspicious. And I think that how they categorize it as accidents, or how do you categorize terror?
Misidentification. That's how they put it. Misidentification. How can you misidentify 3 times?
Yeah, exactly. So this seems not very credible. But there's a related article in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz very recently, who wrote how they tend to target or label anything terrorism, because according to the Israeli armies, they've killed 9,000 to 10,000 terrorists since the war began. However, as Haaretz writes, Israel established a lot of these so-called kill zones in Gaza. So when civilians as well as aid workers crossing into these invisible lines, they're killed and often just listed as Hamas terrorists. So it's effectively a civilian population which is targeted. So I think become ample of evidence that the civilian population is targeted. So I think this sounds more like excuses than a reasonable explanation.
Now, the Israelis say that there will be an independent investigation into the matter, and the facts that will emerge out of this independent investigation will, of course, be put out in the public domain, and they'll also be shared with the World Central Kitchen. Looking at the track record that Israel has when incidents like this happen, do you expect anything to come out of that investigation by the Israelis?
No, in a case like this, you would want an independent investigation to have the perpetrator who carried through these attacks do the investigation. It does sound a bit ridiculous. It's as if the arsonist is going to do the investigation of the fire. It doesn't really make much sense at all. So, and also from the past, I think it's quite evident that. Whatever comes out of this investigation, Israel will be absolved, obviously.
Now, looking at the statement that's been put out by the American president, because the American president, Joe Biden, has been backing the Israeli war, it appears, to the hilt. He has said that he's heartbroken and is outraged because of the manner in which these humanitarian aid workers were targeted. Tell us a bit about how the American role has been in this war, because it is America which has been arming the state of Israel to carry out this offensive in the Gaza Strip in which almost 32,000 Palestinians have been killed. And now the American president says that he is heartbroken and outraged when this aid convoy was targeted. Do you buy what the American president has been saying, that the Americans are trying in good faith to bring about some kind of a ceasefire in this conflict?
No, I think the United States would like to have it both ways. They want to give their unconditional support for Israel to write a blank check, but at the same time they want to uphold their humanitarian credentials. So what you see is the United States supplying all the weapons required for Israel to carry out these attacks, and at the same time asking Israel for restraint, and then expressing all these heartfelt not apologies, but condolences over what has happened. Now, I think in reality, I think this is not just an Israeli war on Gaza. I think it should be seen as an Israeli and American. But you keep seeing this narrative from the United States, is that they're trying to convince Israel not to not attack the civilian population, but at the same time they're the ones supplying the weapons. So how can you explain this? So the U.S. has to airdrop aid, for example, which is just a very small amount compared to what you could get with trucks. Now, if the U.S. is supplying the weapons, how can you explain this? Does the U.S. have obviously has a lot of leverage, given it's the one who's supplying all the bombs? So either it's U.S. is controlled by Israel, which makes it very weak, or the United States is not being completely honest here. So it's a very strange narrative to put forth, but it doesn't really seem very authentic, I would say.
There's a clear doublespeak in terms of what the Americans are saying, that they want a ceasefire and they're working towards it, but on the other hand, they're also supplying weapons to the state of Israel to continue with this offensive. But to talk about the humanitarian aid aspect of it, at this moment, as things stand, humanitarian experts are describing this as a man-made famine, where almost 2.3 million Palestinians at this moment are on the brink of starvation. And what we're looking at is this deliberate, it appears almost in terms of a strategy as to how Israel is targeting, because it's not one or two instances, but repeated instances where humanitarian aid workers have been targeted by the state of Israel. Do you think going forward, despite the fact that the World Court has exhorted the state of Israel to provide humanitarian aid to the Palestinians in Gaza, we will see more humanitarian aid come in, or because of the Israeli strategy of targeting the humanitarian aid workers, fewer of the aid agencies would now want to operate in the Gaza Strip, because the World Central Kitchen has now said that it has suspended its operations there?
Well, yeah, and I think that's, again, fits within a broader context. Keep in mind that after the Israelis pushed the Palestinians out of certain regions of Gaza, they went after the critical infrastructure thereafter, everything including the hospitals, and so there's not much to come back to. And it seems to be the same principle now with humanitarian aid, which is if enough journalists are killed, then there will be less journalists going in there, and you can control the information about the war, and also if enough aid workers feel threatened, and they have to suspend their activities, then obviously this will contribute to the famine. So this does seem like very much a man-made crisis, and again, I think we should get to the key question should be asked: what is the possible end game here? Because if the goal is to drive out all the Palestinians from Gaza or large parts of it, then famine can become a tool towards this end. Now, if the goal is not to remove the Palestinians, exactly what is the objective for Israel? Because this idea that they're merely fighting Hamas, it seems less and less credible by the day.
You know, a lot has been said about Netanyahu and his strategy, and a lot of people have criticized Netanyahu where they've said that Israel simply has got no plan for the day after the war. But the question that I want to ask you is, does the United States of America, that has given its blank check support to Israel, have a plan for day after the war?
No, it doesn't appear so. But again, this has been a problem for the United States for the past, I would say, at least 3 decades. That is, there's very rarely a clearly stated endgame, an exit strategy, but also I think for the United States, and as well as the Europeans for that sake, I think they got dragged very gradually into this, because obviously after the 7th of October there were great sympathy towards the victims in Israel, and also, as the West tends to do, it goes on autopilot in terms of giving unconditional support for Israel. But then as Israel's retaliation, not just against Hamas, but all of the population of Gaza increased, it became the West became more and more dragged into this, to the point now that obviously the US and also to a lesser extent the Europeans are now complicit in what appears to be a genocide occurring in Gaza. So yeah, I think that this is the main problem. No one's addressing what the actual end game is, and I don't think anyone really has one, because it's kind of in a drip gradual situation evolving.
You know, my final question to you, Professor Deason. A few days ago at the United Nations Security Council, the United States of America, very interestingly, chose not to veto a draft resolution for a ceasefire. So at this moment as we speak, there is a UNSC resolution that demands for an immediate ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. But the United States does not appear very keen on enforcing that ceasefire, because it is still sending more weapons to the state of Israel for this war. So what happens to the United Nations Security Council resolution that asks for the ceasefire, and indeed for, you know, UNSC's future?
Well, it will be ignored. I think much like the ICJ's demand that Israeli leaders would stop attacking the civilian population. I think that was ignored, and I think this UN resolution will also be largely ignored. And this is, again, very problematic, because a lot of the key principles now are being abandoned. Again, a principle suggests that rules should be applied equally. And I'm not sure if you watched the speech by John Kirby, which essentially said during the past few months now, the U.S. State Department can't determine that Israel ever violated any international humanitarian law. I mean, this is quite obscene. If this standard would not be applied to any other country on the planet, so it's it is quite shocking. So we are losing a lot here. The authority of the UN is diminished, as well as a lot of the rules and norms of international humanitarian law.
I think you've put it really well there. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Deason, for joining us and getting us that perspective there.
My pleasure again.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.